Hello, Tigers. I'm Colonel Michael Hesse, United States Air Force, and I'm a second-year instructor at the Eisenhower School. It's my pleasure to open this lesson on wicked problems and adaptive leadership. I volunteered to introduce this lesson because I'm intrigued by the idea of wicked problems and the leadership challenge present in meeting them. First, a little about me. I have a background in command and control, as well as in acquisitions, specifically in the area of test and evaluation. I've served in tactical command and control units, such as AWACS, JSTARS, and various ground radar sites, and on headquarters staff. I've been a squadron commander. Finally, in my last assignment, I served as the Director of Combat Operations at the 609th Air Operations Center, overseeing the execution of air operations in the AOR. Like all of you, military or civilian, U.S. or international, I've been asked to solve problems my entire career. As a junior officer, those problems were typically easily understood, limited in scope, or localized. But as my responsibility grew, I was increasingly tasked to solve problems that were less easily understood, broader in scope, and wider ranging in their equities and stakeholders. For example, in my previous assignment at the Air Operations Center, I played a role in planning and executing the Joint Force Air Component Commander's responsibility as the Area Air Defense Commander, ensuring air and missile defense in a joint coalition and international environment. That environment was itself a complex system with a tremendous number of competing stakeholders, interests, and even values. And we had limited authority compared to the need for action. I'll return to this a little later. Okay, enough about me. Lesson 7 introduces two frameworks for problem framing, as well as ideas about problem solving. The first framework is the wicked problem. The Head and Alford reading introduced you to concepts of wicked problems, problems they describe as complex, unpredictable, open-ended, or intractable. The article expands on this description with 10 characteristics of wicked problems, as derived from Riddle and Weber. Those characteristics are summarized and captured in the graphic on the lower right. Personally, I'd summarize wicked problems like this. A wicked problem is in fact a system of interrelated problems, and in some cases, they're symptoms of other problems. Their scope can be very localized or global. Wicked problems are almost exclusively social in nature and include some degree of competing values. Examples of wicked problems might include criminal recidivism, intergenerational poverty, and access to healthcare, or even climate change. Wicked problems associated with national security might include terrorism, insurgency, or weapons proliferation. Wicked problems evade comprehensive or universally accepted definition, and when you do define them, it implies a solution, and that solution is almost always incomplete. Finally, wicked problems are typically never solved and are instead managed. Now, I suspect that you aren't strangers to complex and intractable problems. The Head and Alford article is interesting because it describes the nature of wicked problems, and then it walks the reader through why we struggle to deal with them. Some examples would include organizational barriers, hierarchies, stovepipes, poor incentives, and conflicting values. Finally, the article concludes with some tentative recommendations on how to address wicked problems. Those recommendations focus on greater collaboration, new ways of understanding, and most importantly, on new models of leadership, transformational, adaptive, and collaborative. If you haven't read the Head and Alford article yet, I'd ask that when you do, that you pay particular attention to their thoughts on adaptive and collaborative leadership and how they relate to wicked problems. If you have read it, I'd recommend you go back and reread it. It's pages 728 through 731. Their thinking is heavily influenced by Heifetz and others. For the sake of brevity, I've extracted a few powerful quotes that capture the essence of the ideas. Quote, Heifetz argued that leaders quite often encounter situations where it is beyond the cognitive capabilities of any individual to identify what is wrong and determine ways of addressing it. The knowledge and insights relevant to the issue are instead distributed amongst those who are led. Quote, Heifetz offered a second approach to dealing with complex, intractable situations, adaptive leadership. Such leaders should lead organizational members and or stakeholders in understanding themselves the collective work of grappling with the problem. And finally, quote, collaborative leadership entails leading without the levers of control or monetary incentives normally available in hierarchy or managerial command. Furthermore, it leverages the capacity to determine who is in the collaboration by virtue of who gets invited, frame the issue, orchestrate the agenda, recognize particular expertise, engage in win-win negotiations, spot entrepreneurial opportunities, and generally engage in diplomacy. In a nutshell, adaptive and collaborative leadership is a leadership that doesn't provide answers, but instead mobilizes others and provides an environment where problems are evaluated and confronted. Furthermore, this leadership is executed largely without explicit or statutory authority and instead relies on a more collaborative style that accentuates commonalities and bridges or bypasses gaps between stakeholders. So, now that we've established the idea of a wicked problem and touched on the idea of what sort of leadership might best serve an organization confronting a wicked problem, how should you address a wicked problem? The Cynefin framework offers some ideas. The Cynefin framework syncs well, but not perfectly, with the idea of wicked problems. In the Cynefin framework video, David Snowden does a great job explaining the model and its application. If you haven't done so, watch it attentively, as it has a lot of nuances. I'd summarize it like this. The Cynefin framework encourages individuals and organizations to evaluate what sort of system their problem is embedded in. Once that evaluation is complete, the framework bins the problem in a particular domain and suggests the sort of action or expertise that should be pursued to confront the problem. For example, problems resident in the simple and complicated domain are the product of organized systems that have discernible cause and effect that is evident to practitioners or operators, or in the case of the complicated domain, experts. Solutions are available. However, in the complex domain, cause and effect is visible only in hindsight. In the chaotic one, cause and effect may not be understood at all. People confronting problems in these latter two domains must probe and then sense and respond. Or in the case of chaotic problems, act and then sense and respond. As I mentioned, the framework has a lot of nuance. Near the end of the video, Dave Snowden observes that with a single exception, problems can transition smoothly between domains. For example, a complicated problem might evolve into a complex one with the passage of time or the addition of new variables. The exception is the border between the chaotic and simple domain, which he describes as a cliff. Going over the cliff, in other words, transitions from simple to chaotic. It is a disaster that is difficult to recover from. I mentioned that the Cynefin framework syncs well but not perfectly with the wicked problem framework. In my mind, wicked problems inhabit the space of the chaotic and at least some portion of the complex domains. I like the Cynefin framework because it encourages reflection on the problem with an explicit understanding that some of those problems are the product of complex and chaotic systems, and as such, they might not be treatable by existing practices. I also appreciate the fact that when operating in these domains, whether you are probing or acting, you must then sense and respond, recognizing that any response is emergent or novel. Because it's emergent or novel, sensing and framework is implicitly iterative and demands course correction. In a quickly evolving national security context where we have adversaries, I think this is essential. Okay, so what? It is the intent of this lesson to provide you tools to better understand the problems you will face, particularly the wicked ones, and what sort of responses are best suited to them. Likewise, the video and readings offer new ways of thinking about organizing and leading, particularly in light of the fact that virtually every wicked problem you will face will exceed the scope of your organization's responsibility and authority. When I introduced myself, I talked a little about my role in planning and executing air and missile defense in the AOR. In that context, I wish I'd been exposed to some of these frameworks. While wicked problems wasn't in my vocabulary then, it certainly was one. It would have been great to recognize that as a wicked problem, it was essentially unique, and attempts to leverage previous experience would be incomplete or even counterproductive. Additionally, difficulties surrounding air defense were symptoms of other problems, And I needed to appreciate that fact and work upstream too. And finally, it would have been great to appreciate that neither a definitive nor wholly satisfactory solution was going to emerge. In terms of the Cynefin framework, it would have been nice to have explicitly understood and planned from the get-go for a more iterative approach to problem solving centered on probing or acting, followed by sensing and responding. Lastly, it would have been great to have been more deliberate in organizing and leading to meet wicked problems. JP 308 Organizational Cooperation, which you should have considered in a previous lesson, is a great guide on how to coordinate military operations with other U.S. departments and agencies, state, local, and tribal governments, foreign military and government agencies, international organizations, NGOs, and the private sector. But it doesn't tell you how to lead. I was very lucky to have senior leaders in the theater modeling adaptive and collaborative leadership, enabling our efforts. But I wish I'd wrestled with those leadership concepts earlier. So with that in mind, when you leave NDU, will you be ready to diagnose and attend to wicked problems? Will you develop strategies appropriately tailored to them? Will ideas about transformational, adaptive, or collaborative leadership have a place in your repertoire? As part of this lesson, you'll have an opportunity to apply the wicked problem and Cynefin frameworks to address issues of great power competition in selected readings. I hope you find the effort useful. The opportunity for application will be extended further as you wrestle with an adaptive problem across the remainder of the course. These frameworks will be joined in subsequent lessons by other theories, frameworks, and models, for example, causality framing and metaphoric thinking, in an effort to prepare you for senior leadership. Okay, Tigers, thank you for your attention today, and as always, go Tigers.